The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Few American politicians have enjoyed as distinguished a career as Democrat Tom Foley. First elected to the 5th District of Washington State in 1964, he served in the House of Representatives for 30 years. In 1980, he became the House Majority Whip. In 1987, he moved up to be House Majority Leader, and in 1989, he was elected Speaker of the House, the highest leadership position in the chamber. A seasoned political statesman, Tom Foley presided over one of the most tumultuous periods of congressional history when the Democrats lost both houses of Congress for the first time in over 4 decades. Tom Foley, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
What did you do before you entered the Congress?
Well, my father was a prosecuting attorney and a judge in my hometown of Spokane, Washington, and I practiced law briefly in Spokane and then became a deputy prosecuting attorney, assistant attorney general. And I thought I was probably going to perhaps follow in my father's footsteps and may perhaps one day become a judge. But I was interested in being a United States attorney for Eastern Washington when John Kennedy was elected president and didn't make that job, but got invited by Senator Henry M. Jackson to come back to Washington and serve on the Interior Committee of the Senate. And from then, he encouraged me to run for the House in 1964.
1964 was quite a year. We all have in our minds about the recent election, and we think of it as this big Republican win, 51% of the vote, about 20 electoral votes more than a majority. But that was the year, if I remember, Lyndon Johnson won with 61% of the popular vote, 480 electoral votes. And I have it written down here, the margin in the House was 295 Democrats to 140 Republicans. That must have been quite a heady time. What was it like when you first showed up at the House of Representatives that year?
Well, it's always an exciting thing when you first get elected to Congress. I think every election I watch young members, now young for me, of course, come to Washington, Republicans and Democrats. I remember what an excitement it was that first election and the first opportunity to serve in the House. I had worked for Senator Jackson for 3 years, so I fancied myself a little bit of a Washington hand. I worked in the Senate. I knew the Senate quite well, and so I was, even with my colleagues, kind of playing the role of the more experienced in Washington ways.
Well, that must have been one heck of a freshman class, though.
It was, big class. We had about 80 members of that, I think.
And almost all Democrats.
Yes.
So what did you all expect when you got there? Did you think that you were going to right all the wrongs of the last 10 years?
Well, I don't think so, but I think there was an excitement that the country was moving, in our view, toward achieving some solutions to problems we had, and it was a kind of excitement in the air. I remember we had a member of Congress from the Midwest who addressed the group. And this is a group, again, filled with enthusiasm and idealism. And he said he wanted to warn us against the single greatest danger that could occur to a new member coming into the Congress. And we thought this was some ethical trap or other. And he said, remember, the greatest danger is thinking for yourselves. I thought to myself, what does he mean by that, thinking for ourselves? He said, trust the assistant or the chairman of the committee. He said, trust the chairman of the Democratic caucus. Trust the Democratic whip. Trust the Democratic leader. And especially, he said, trust, revere, and support the speaker. And I remember being annoyed, outraged. This senior member was telling us to subcontract our judgment to senior leaders of the party. I didn't get elected to do that. And he said, even making it worse, in my experience, he said, more people have gotten in trouble in this body by thinking for themselves than by stealing money. And that was just the end. I was furious, personally angry.
If we could, let's go back to those first Congresses you were in, because I think that period of time, well, we're at risk of forgetting about it. Lyndon Johnson's elected, the Great Society, a spewing of major legislation which still shapes our world today. Did you and your colleagues know that you were creating an edifice that would, 50 years later, still be the main structure? 40 years later, excuse me.
Well, I think we realized that there were some significant seminal bills that were being passed and programs that were being established. I remember, I think the first one, one of the first ones that I voted on was one called rent supplements. And this was a program to give rental assistance to poor people, disabled people, people who are otherwise unable to get adequate housing. And if you want to characterize it, it was kind of like a food stamp program for rents. And for some reason, I decided I thought that was going a little too far too fast, and I voted against it. Shortly after that, the delegation was invited down to see President Lyndon Johnson. And all the new members, plus Senator Magnuson Jackson, and Julia Butler Hanson, who was our senior House member. And the first thing President Johnson did, looking at all of us from the rocking chair that President Kennedy made famous, he said, the first thing I want to do is to thank the Washington State delegation for its vote on rent supplements. And looking right at me, he said, take a damn fool to vote against that bill. It had help for the unemployed, it had help for the elderly, it had help for the handicapped. It was supported by business, it was supported by labor, it was supported by the handicapped community. It was supported by a broad swath of Americans, and you'd have to be cold-hearted and unintelligent and stupid or something almost to that point. Pretty harsh words, looking right at me. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I better tell him I voted against it. And then it became clear to me that I was getting what some people used to call the Johnson treatment. And he knew how I had voted. He watched the votes very carefully in the Congress. So I didn't come up to full expectations right away.
I met him once. He was a tremendously large man.
Very imposing physically.
And did that have was that part of his effectiveness as a politician? Could he just stare you down?
I think so. I mean, he did wonderful things. I don't want to tell these anecdotes and leave the wrong impression. Lyndon Johnson had a vision for the country, which I think he achieved in such great measure that we're still very, very deeply indebted to him. The problems of the war in Vietnam and other things intervened, but the finest speech I heard him give was on the Voting Rights Act, which was an emotional speech about giving every American the right to cast a vote and to participate in American life. But he was also a master at persuasion. No question about that. And his physical bearing, he was a very physically imposing man. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, broad-shouldered, and when he puts his arm around you, not to me particularly, but with others, and reasoned with them, as they say, it was usually quite.
And you're a pretty big guy yourself.
Not too small.
Yeah. And then the next Democrat was Jimmy Carter. Mm-hmm. And he had notoriously bad relations with the Congress, or at least with Tip O'Neill and so forth. What happened there?
Well, I think it was in part the fact that, and by the way, I think President Carter has had an enormous success. Whatever people say about his presidency, his post-presidential life has been one that's been covered with achievement and contribution. Maybe more than hardly almost any ex-president in our history. But he came to Washington critical of the institutions of the city. And he ran a somewhat populist campaign against the bureaucracies and the insensitivity of government. All those things have some ring of truth and reality. But he also didn't seem to be at once comfortable with the city, or the city, in the broad sense, comfortable with him. we used to go to breakfast meetings with President Carter, and he and Tip O'Neill and others. And I would notice that, you know, as a practical matter, they were just different personalities. Jimmy Carter didn't drink very much. Tip O'Neill drank moderately, but had an easygoing manner and sort of Irish Paul background. They were both wonderful men and great leaders, but they didn't mesh exactly well on many occasions. I would have to say that President Carter was one of the brightest presidents that I ever came in contact with, talking about what you would say in terms of being a bright student or having a prehensile memory. In fact, I was often amazed at the detail that he knew about government programs, sometimes correcting his own staff on details. But I'm not sure that's the most important thing a president needs to do.
Some have said that that was his greatest weakness.
Well, I remember being amazed once that he knew the difference between feed grain equivalents and corn and so forth in an agriculture program, which I knew about because I was the chairman of the Agriculture Committee. But I didn't think the President of the United States really needed to be that detailed in his knowledge.
Now, well, I was going to get to this later, but this reminds me of the fact that in 44 years, every winning Democratic candidate for president has been from the South.
Well, I think there may be some interesting things to note there. Also, most of the winning candidates have come from governorships rather than from the Congress. I revere the Congress. I served there for 30 years. But I wonder if it isn't just a little bit easier in many ways to be a candidate that comes out of an executive or state governorship background. Let me explain that.
Mm-hmm.
This year we had a presidential election in which Senator Kerry's votes were criticized in the Senate. I voted for it before I voted against it. The famous line about the $87 billion. When you're in the context of working in Congress, it is a matter often of compromise and adjustment. I'll support this bill if you'll pay for it with at least some equal amounts of cutbacks. And you tell me, no, I won't do that. I want it to stand on its own. So I vote against it, even though I like other parts of the bill. And then the next time around, maybe the bill fails, and so you say, okay, I'll pay for it now. So I vote for it. It's not hard to go back and find in a member's record a superficial, he voted for it, he voted against it, he voted for it, he voted against it. I think on the B-1 bomber, I probably voted 3 different ways on that bill.
George Bush did that to John McCain.
Yeah.
In 2000
right.
on a vote about a cancer
right.
provision. It was a minor provision.
Now, if you get involved, if you know the Congress very well, that's perfectly normal and perfectly principled. In fact, often it is very principled. But it lends itself to easy caricature and attack. It's also true that many members of Congress don't take, at least in the Senate, as hard a single line as maybe often appears in the case of governors, where they have a program that they present that they try to make coherent and easy to understand.
And they're also used to managing a little bit more, which I think is a crucial skill.
That's true. Some governors are good at it, some are not so good. But it's true that there is some reason to think that, as a generality, that coming from the Senate may be somewhat more difficult in the way of focusing a coherent and a more defensible record.
Now, of course, in our generation, the Southern governor we think about is Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
Now, 1992, he comes with an agenda with only 43% of the popular vote, but a mandate In my preparing for our discussion, it appeared to me that you and the leadership in the Senate tried to accommodate their priorities. It was almost as if they were proposing and you were going to try to enact. Have I got that about right?
I think that's true. That's what the president does in any administration, proposes, and the Congress disposes, as I say. But I think we, who were in the congressional leadership, George Mitchell in the Senate, I and others in the House, this was the first Democratic president that had come into office in 12 years. So we were trying to find ways to cooperate in providing assistance and getting programs through that he was giving priority to. And of course, the one that comes to mind, the most important one at the time, was the health care program, which did not succeed. And I think contributed, because its failure, that is, contributed to the general bad political mood in 1994, which led to the loss of the House.
Before that, though, there were a number of bills that did not enjoy wide support within the Democratic caucus, and you all had to really push to get them out of the Congress. I'm thinking about the budget.
Yes, the budget, 1993 budget.
Where I think in the Senate it was passed, in the House passed by one vote.
One vote.
And the Senate, the Vice President broke the tie, if I remember correctly.
And I think, in retrospect, that budget looks very good, I think. It was a responsible budget. It didn't get a single Republican vote in the House. It provided some tax increases, but it also had some serious income spending reductions. It was a hard vote for members. It raised the gasoline tax, not very much, but a little bit, which in Western states was considered a curse. And one of our members, Roger Margolis,
from Pennsylvania,
cast a vote that the Republicans thought, I think, was the vote. All votes are fungible, but the vote that passed the bill. And they were chanting on the other side of the House, "Goodbye, Margie, goodbye, goodbye." And she lost the election.
She lost. But in fact,
what I think was one of the great acts of political heroism and courage, to vote for what she thought was the right thing to do and the right vote for the country. It was certainly clear to her it was not a politically easy vote. It was a highly dangerous vote.
But it made almost, since these were margins of one vote, it made almost every Democrat, right, the margin of victory. So the Republicans could go after every member and say, if this member had voted differently.
That's true.
And you had to push through a gun control bill as well. Is that right?
Well, we had a bill that dealt with assault weapons, which has just been allowed to expire. And it was also a highly controversial bill in many parts of the country. We had a crime bill, a separate crime bill, which added police and took other anti-crime measures. And in the Senate, they added the assault weapons ban to the crime bill. And I tried, along with others, Dick Gephardt, to persuade the administration that we should separate them, because it made it very difficult for many of our members who came from areas where any bill that dealt with gun control, even assault weapons, was going to be extremely controversial. But in order to vote against that bill, they had to vote against the crime bill. So it put them in a very awkward situation. And they were taken together, and many members, I think, attribute that vote to their defeat.
Well, in fact, I have a quotation here from the Washington Post about that time and you, and it says here that you reluctantly voted for President Clinton's assault ban. They, meaning you and Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jack Brooks, they might as well have swallowed a shot of hot lead.
Well, it's a very strongly felt issue. I think people who don't, particularly people outside the United States, sometimes don't realize exactly how emotional it is. I remember going back and running for Congress that year, and I went out to Kaiser aluminum plant, and a worker came up to me and said, you know, I'll vote for you as I have in the past, as long as you tell me you didn't vote for the crime bill. And I said, well, I did. I did vote for it. And he said, well, I can't vote for you. And then he went on to say, it was interesting to me, he said, I don't think anybody ought to own an assault weapon. I own a lot of guns. I don't have any interest in owning an assault weapon. It doesn't make any sense to me. I know I could buy one now. I could buy 2 or 3 of them under the moratorium. That's not why I am upset. I'm upset because it seems to me that so many of you in Congress worry about regulating us, the hardworking, tax-paying, law-abiding citizens, that we seem to always be on your agenda for regulation and control. He thought of himself, of course, as so many do in the country, in the West and South, and the hunting tradition is part of their identification, part of how they feel about themselves. And anyway, he was very, very upset when he said this. And I think that's a problem that, again, when they talk about the gun issue, we have let it seem to many people that we're interested, the Democrats or members of Congress who are in the Democratic Party, are interested in eventually going beyond whatever the legislation is and going farther and farther. And that's perhaps a technique that's used by opponents. It's exactly the same kind of technique, by the way, that's used by the American Civil Liberties Union when they say, you know, if you take away this right to speak or this subject you restrict, eventually it can limit all speech. And that's what those who are opposed to gun control suggest. Disarm America is the inevitable goal. That's not true, but it's an issue we have to deal with. And I think, frankly, we ought to concentrate on gun safety. That is, you know, preventing accidental firing of guns. We ought to concentrate, perhaps, which the NRA and others approve of stiffening up penalties for the misuse of guns committed in crimes, and so on. The chance of moving any kind of significant gun regulation, I think, is very dim.
I think we all, on either side of the aisle, applaud people who vote their conscience. So I don't want to, I'm not talking conscience, I'm just talking politics for a second. People on the coast, all right, don't quite understand this issue about gun control and seem to be unforgiving to Democrats who might be willing to let the issue, as you said, become less important, and a number of issues like that seem to have pushed the Democratic Party into minority status. Not this was still a close election and so forth, and we talked about the gerrymandering, but it does seem as if the Democrats will have to respond to these kinds of feelings in other parts of the country if they're going to be a majority party again, or the country's going to have to change.
I think that's true. I think there's a point, I mean, at which you have to consider whether positions you take are detrimental to your opportunity to get reelected or elected, and whether the other things the party stands for are going to be hurt by that. We used to have in my state occasionally a right-to-work initiative which allowed people not to be able to join labor unions. And every time I was put on the ballot, it failed. And every time it was offered, there were more and more Republicans who supported it who were defeated. So finally, they stopped putting it on the ballot. There has to be a point at which you recognize whether an issue is going to go forward or not, or whether it's going to impede other good things that the party wants to do. I'm not saying, you know, make up a list of things that are just the most popular and don't take up any serious causes, but this one's a tough one. I was endorsed by the NRA for about, I think, 6 or 8 elections, and I know what it is on both sides of that issue. But we need to understand how people feel about this. There's a very strong emotional and some would argue intellectual case for this that needs to be understood. And we have to cross the cultural divide here a little bit, as others have suggested. You know, Many people of our age have had trouble growing up talking about their religious convictions and have led people to assume they don't have any, that they don't have any religious concerns, they don't have any religious values, and so on. So to some extent, I think the Democratic Party needs to think a little bit about how it presents itself to a very large number of people who are concerned about patriotism, hard work, opportunity, faith and family, those things that so many millions of Americans who are Democrats deeply, deeply believe in, and avoid the caricature that's getting them pushed by some people, I think, that Democrats are all, unconcerned, secular, unworldly, don't have any considerations of faith or family or principle or moral values. That's a canard, but it can seep into public consciousness. It can become the subject of a kind of political propaganda that can be damaging.
This has been a fascinating conversation, but we unfortunately have to draw it to a close. Tom Foley, thank you very much for coming to Policy Watch at the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.